My name is Mary Buser. I'm a social worker, and I wrote the book Lockdown on Rikers, which is about my experience working in the mental health department at New York City's Rikers Island. It is the story of my journey from idealistic intern all the way to assistant chief of mental health in the 500-cell solitary confinement unit. And it's this issue of solitary confinement that I would like to discuss in this video. And in particular, I would like to focus on the role of mental health professionals who work in these units. But first, just what is solitary confinement? Well, most people have some sense of it from movies about jails and prisons. We hear it go by the slang names of the shoe, the box, the hole. It has official names such as punitive segregation, special housing. But regardless of what you call it, it all comes down to the same thing, which is confinement to a cell about the size of a parking space for 23 hours a day. There is no meaningful human contact. Food trays are passed through a flap in the cell door. The reason someone is placed in solitary is usually, not always, but usually, as punishment for an infraction ranging from disobeying orders to assault on staff. The length of time someone spends in here also ranges from a few days to decades. So what do mental health professionals do in these units? Well, first and foremost, solitary confinement is a psychological punishment, and it is a grueling punishment. So much so that our mental health team had to monitor the people inside these cells for mental deterioration and especially for suicidal behavior. We had a saying at Rikers, if they have no mental health issues before they entered solitary, they do now. And as such, we dispensed mountains of psychiatric medication, antipsychotics, antidepressants, sleeping pills, you name it. And I remember when I first started working in this unit asking myself, what kind of a punishment is this that people need to be medicated in order to endure it? But it turned out that for us, dispensing medication was actually the easy part. It was what happened when these meds could no longer hold a human psyche together, when the rigors of isolation resulted in self-mutilation and suicide attempts, that we would be called to a cell door. And I have to tell you that it was grim. I witnessed people covered in blood, covered in excrement. I saw people banging their heads against the cinder block walls incessantly. I saw bare skulls, incoherent babbling, makeshift nooses, agonized shell-shocked faces begging us for some relief from this extreme suffering. And in fact, the mental health department had the authority to issue a temporary reprieve, but only in cases where we felt that someone was at a very high risk of death. And even then, we were under fierce pressure not to let people out. The reason being that this was the punishment and people were expected to endure it. But we were also to be sure that no one actually died. One warden said to me, I need a strong mental health team in here. I do not want to call at 4 o'clock in the morning that someone is hanging for real. So this shows us just how grueling solitary confinement is. And it also shows just how intertwined a mental health team is in carrying out this practice. So what did we do in these cases? Well, we would try to talk to the person, we would gauge the cuts, the gashes, we would huddle to the side of the cell and try to make a decision. Could we increase the medication, change the medication? Could they hang on for a few more days? Or was it likely that in the morning they could be dead? And as we struggled with these decisions, I often had the sense that far from that idealistic intern that I had once been who wanted to help people, I was now essentially a monitor of human suffering. We all were. But I brushed these thoughts from my mind, telling myself that this could not be as bad as it seems. Why not? because this is the United States, and we are a country that is progressive on human rights. The American flag is flying above the jail. Across the country, mental health workers are doing the exact same thing that we were doing because solitary confinement is standard punishment throughout the country. But I continued to have doubts and misgivings, especially when I heard an interesting story about Senator John McCain, who was famously held as a POW in Vietnam. For 5 years, McCain was tortured. He was beaten, his bones were broken, and he suffered unspeakable treatment as a POW. But he had this to say about his captivity afterwards. He said that of everything that he endured, the worst of it was solitary confinement. We are outraged by the treatment that John McCain suffered in Vietnam, and yet somehow we don't connect that to the exact same treatment that is meted out through our jails and prisons here in the United States, where 80 to 100,000 people are currently held in solitary confinement. It seems to me that as a country that prides itself on human rights, we have lost our way. In 2011, the United Nations declared that solitary confinement beyond 15 days constitutes torture. So we're now hearing that word officially. More recently, in 2016, President Obama called for reforms to solitary confinement and abolished it for juveniles in the federal prison system. So we're starting to see this punishment that has been hidden in the recesses of jails and prisons coming out into the light of the public square and being questioned. And I'm wondering if mental health professionals shouldn't also be questioning our participation in this and asking ourselves if we haven't also lost our way. If mental health professionals did not participate in solitary confinement or place limits on our involvement, reform would be inevitable and it would be swift. There are those who say that solitary is necessary to keep jails and prisons safe, but I would argue that that is a myth, that other countries manage to achieve safety without resorting to solitary confinement. So can we. If nothing else, it is time for mental health professionals to stand by our code of ethics, because solitary confinement in its current form is no place for the helping professions. Thank you.